I'm Brent Goff. It's good to have you with us as the feud between the leaders of the United States and Ukraine goes from bad to worse. Donald Trump's envoy to Ukraine, Kellogg, is in Kyiv today for talks with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Kellogg is there to discuss the conditions for further U.S. military support, but tensions have escalated into a war of words between Trump and Zelenskyy. And it's coming not long after Ukraine rejected a deal that would have seen the U.S., in return for more aid, gaining access to vast amounts of Ukrainian natural resources. Today, officials say that a news conference planned for after the talks, that news conference has been canceled by the U.S. The rift between Trump and Zelenskyy has deepened in the last 48 hours, and I asked DW's Nick Connolly in Kyiv if there is an obvious way out of this.
Well, Brent, we've definitely seen people who have Donald Trump's ear but still support Ukraine, people like Boris Johnson, former UK Prime Minister, trying to give them a way out. We had an intervention from Johnson in which he basically explained both Trump's comments and saying that they were not meant to be taken kind of as historically kind of accurate, and they were just about trying to call Europeans to action. At the same time, defending Ukraine for not holding elections, saying that that was normal. That was basically the same thing that the UK, Britain had done during the Second World War. So there are those people also like Lindsey Graham, trying to kind of connect both sides. But it is seemingly getting worse. We've had just in the last couple of hours, Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor, on Fox News telling the Ukrainians to tone it down and sign that deal. That is not something that people here will take to with any kind of acceptance. That is just a different tone that they're not used to. As for the press conference, it's one thing if that press conference had been cancelled ahead of the meeting. It was going to be very difficult for Kellogg to explain the dictator comment and would face questions whether or not Zelenskyy is a dictator or not. But that last-minute cancellation really has spooked people.
And, Nick, we know that there has been another push by Washington to get Ukraine to sign this minerals deal, a deal in exchange for military aid. What do we know about the terms of this deal? And do we know, is there any chance that Zelenskyy will say yes?
So the terms are not out in the open. There have been various stories with unnamed sources, some of the Ukrainian sources saying that this is vast. This is not just about, a kind of participation in minerals extraction, that Trump wants hundreds of millions of dollars in return, a lot more than US aid has so far totaled, and that it goes beyond minerals, that it would include ports and other kind of strategic objects coming under kind of American commercial control, largely seemingly to the exclusion of other countries, of European business also kind of shut out of this deal. So it is much, much bigger than we immediately kind of afterwards imagined. And it seems for now that Zelenskyy, sees no way of signing this. And, basically, for now, this is, a kind of slow motion crash that is happening with little kind of, way out, no seeming willingness to compromise from Washington.
Yeah, a crash, and bystanders can't help themselves but to watch. DW's Nick Connolly reporting tonight from Kyiv. As always, Nick, thank you. I spoke earlier with our Brussels correspondent, Rosie Birchard, about how European leaders see this escalation of rhetoric by Trump towards Zelenskyy.
Look, they are very jittery indeed because, of course, they're trying to strike this balancing act between avoiding the ire of President Trump, but also declaring that some of these accusations made by the US president are entirely contrary to European positions. So we've had Germany, for example, saying that some of the president's accusations against President Zelenskyy lacking democratic legitimacy are simply absurd. But from other countries, there's been more, it seems to me, of an attempt to not to criticise on the record, but just to express their own position. So the Polish finance minister, for example, says President Trump must be misinformed, instead arguing that, in fact, Europe has contributed more financially to supporting Ukraine than the United States has. From the United Kingdom side, we heard the Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, having a phone call with President Zelenskyy, expressing his support for Zelenskyy as Ukraine's democratically elected leader, but also saying that he supports US-led efforts to find lasting peace. And when I asked the European Commission spokesperson about this today here in Brussels, they struck a similar tone. So not criticising President Trump on the record, but expressing their own position. Here's what they had to say.
President Zelenskyy was legitimately elected in free, fair and democratic elections. Ukraine is a democracy. Putin's Russia is not. There can be no solution for Ukraine without the involvement of Ukraine, nor without the involvement of the European Union. Ukraine's security is the European Union's security.
What really strikes me here is that over these last 3 years, I have covered countless summits, diplomatic meetings, where European officials and diplomats have thrown a lot of diplomatic weight behind trying to convince other countries that Russia invaded Ukraine in violation of the UN Charter, and countries like India, South Africa, trying to pull them off the fence. And here, of course, with just one social media post from the US president, all those efforts from the Europeans feel, I think many of them behind closed doors at least, that they've just gone up in smoke.
And Rosie, the French President Emmanuel Macron, the UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, they are due to meet Donald Trump at the White House to discuss a role for Europe in these negotiations. What might that role look like? Do we know?
Well, we know that the United States wants Europeans to be the ones to back up any potential down-the-line ceasefire deal on the ground, because the US does not want any of its troops to be involved in a potential peacekeeping force at some point in the future. Now, it looks like the United Kingdom and France are kind of taking the lead here. We're hearing reports, discussions of some sort of a reassurance force in Ukraine as a plan, potentially less than 30,000 troops, mainly focusing on air and maritime security. Now, we should say at this stage, these are just reports, but these are also just ideas, because the German position, which has been said very clearly, is that it's simply not the time. It's too premature to be talking about a peacekeeping force because there is no deal, there is no ceasefire deal, there is no peace. Ukraine is still very much facing Russian aggression, and that so far Germany has said that they feel that this is being negotiated over Ukraine's head, and of course neither Europe nor Ukraine really has any seat at the table yet.
DW's Rosie Birchard with the latest from Brussels tonight. Rosie, as always, thank you. I spoke with military analyst Frank Ledwidge. He told me more about this European idea of sending a reassurance force of up to 30,000 peacekeeper troops to Ukraine.
Well, good evening, Brent. As Rosie said there, this is more of an idea than a plan. I don't think there's any particular well thought out or militarily gamed rationale behind this. And indeed, as John Healey, the UK Defence Secretary, said today, I think quite bluntly, said we're jumping ahead of ourselves. But to answer your question, perhaps to put it into context, I've been involved with many peacekeeping missions. The first one was Bosnia, where we had a US-European force of 60,000, really well armed, really well armoured, well funded, well sorted out and supplied, and all the rest of it, for a territory about 1/12 the size of Ukraine. Now, there's a lot of variables there, and there's no direct comparison. Similarly, in Kosovo, which is about a third of that size, we had 40,000. The latest scheme, which doesn't seem to me to be much more than a back-of-the-envelope plan involving air and maritime, seems particularly ill thought out. I don't see that going anywhere. But the overall answer to your question is 30,000 troops, a fraction of whom will be able for patrolling, is entirely insignificant for any kind of credible force.
And the Ukrainian president, he's requested 200,000 troops. 30,000, if I'm hearing you right, that's just a drop in the bucket. That's not going to make a difference.
Well, that's right for pretty much anything. Of course, it depends for what the mission is designed. In other words, what are you trying to achieve? What are the tasks you have to fulfill? What is the mandate going to be? And to my mind, by the way, another question is, what's the end game? In other words, where's your off-ramp? The mistakes we had in the past were not to think about those questions before they started. These ideas of 100,000 or 200,000 for presumably some kind of border buffer force or trigger force could only take place given the requirements of rotation schedules and really quite heavy armament if other major players were involved. I'm thinking here Turkey, India, or whisper who dares China, because China's made an offer for this at the Munich Security Conference. They're the only people that can supply this kind of bulk and make sure it's sustained.
And can you imagine, Frank, that actually coming to fruition, that we would have Chinese and European troops keeping the peace in eastern Ukraine?
Well, I've no trouble imagining that. Whether anyone else at sort of higher levels can imagine it, and particularly Russia and the US, or Ukraine for that matter, is a different matter. It's worth remembering that China was Ukraine's largest trading partner before the war. They're going to have an interest in rebuilding the country, and they've expressed an interest in being part of the force. Needless to say, Europe will have a say about this as well, given that they would, I think, wish to provide the core of a force. But look, European armed forces are atrophied. They're less than half the size they were 20 years ago and are not really capable of providing credible bulk or indeed credible armament or deterrent value to any reassurance force or whatever you want to call it.
And so what would have to happen that would be realistic? If the United States doesn't want to be responsible for this keeping the peace operation, should it at least give the Europeans a time horizon that they can work in? Should it say, okay, you've got 5 years to put this thing together and then we will be gone? I mean, it feels like President Trump is just flipping the switch and saying, we're out of here.
Well, usually what happens is your mandate is renewed. Now, that mandate can be, or really should be, and the Russians, I think, would only accept it if it were under some kind of UN remit. That doesn't mean blue helmets. It just means some kind of UN mandate that's renewed, and the troops operate under that mandate, be they NATO or other international soldiers. And that's the kind of arrangement we've had in the past that works reasonably well. Look, all of this is highly speculative. Yeah. President Trump, as you say, has flipped the switch on this very quickly, and I think they've caught a lot of people on the hop, which is why people, I think, are getting ahead of themselves with this and unable to appreciate, or rather perhaps poorly advised, as to what European forces can actually, when push comes to shove, supply for such a mission, which is minimal. And we have to remember, we're not just talking about troops on the ground. The key element to a lot of this, or most of it, is logistics and the implications of that, which are airfields, air bases. Will the Russians accept that as part of a deal? Unlikely, I think. And then most importantly for me, as a former soldier on the ground, is what kind of cover you're going to have? Who's going to assure your safety? How are you going to be defended from drones, from aircraft, from artillery, from hybrid attacks? In other words, who's going to assure your safety? Now, in the past, that was the kind officers of the US Air Force. Now, if that's not going to happen, I'd really want to know, well, who is going to supply that kind of assurance?
Military analyst Frank Ledwidge with a very important reality check tonight. Frank, as always, good to talk with you. We appreciate your insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Brent.